Hello, friends. Welcome to Fiscal Focus on DawnNews English. This is Danish Khan, and today I'm joined by Dr. Aasim Sajjad Akhtar. He's professor at Quaid-e-Azam University, and he writes about political, economic, and development issues pertaining to Pakistan. Thank you, Aasim, for joining me today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I recently read your piece in Dawn about Land Reforms Act in Gilgit-Baltistan, and Gilgit-Baltistan remains uh, beyond the imaginary of mainland Pakistan because it's less discussed and also less understood. So tell us about Gilgit-Baltistan or GB short, because in the mainland Pakistan, GB is only seen as a tourist destination.
Yeah, very briefly, basically, GB is clumped together as part of the so-called Kashmir dispute. And just by saying that, actually, sort of in a sense, glosses over the fact that this is a distinct region with distinct history and culture. But because it's clumped together with the Kashmir dispute, sort of as sort of the greater Kashmir area, what that has meant is that actually GB is in constitutional limbo. So there's no mention of it in Pakistan's constitution. And as such, the people there, approximately about a population of 2 million people, have no meaningful political and economic or constitutional rights. But as you say, nevertheless, it like many other peripheries in Pakistan, like Balochistan, or you could have many more examples. Um, the people of the region may not matter to those in power, but the resources of the region do. The gateway, the fact that it's the gateway, some of your listeners will know that the Karakoram Highway was built that allowed there to be sort of an overland route to the Chinese border, and it is the sort of gateway to cpec as well. So really, it's a region where, in a sense, you have the suspension of people's rights, but the resources and the land and the access routes are considered fair game. And just to close, the piece that I wrote was about something called the land, as you said, the Land Reform Act. Ironically, the term land reform, I think for most progressives, would tend to refer to, some kind of redistributive measure, where you sort of break up concentrated land holdings and you redistribute amongst those who don't have land. And that, even in the economics literature, is generally considered to give rise to more productivity and so on. But here, in this case, the Land Reform Act is this sort of strange bill, which is essentially giving the rights to state or the administrators of GB to determine different legal categories of land. And in regions like GB, you have large amounts of land which are not privately owned or do not classically fall into the categories of private or public ownership, but are common property resources. And so, really, the Land Reform Act is giving a lot of power to administrators to determine how to classify this land. And local people in GB are very concerned that this will mean more sort of expropriation, more arbitrary decision making, more outsiders coming in to own resources, which, like many such peripheries, gives rise to concerns about demographic change, about further erosion of political and economic rights. So yeah, as you say, it's not just a tourist destination. There's a lot more going on, and I think. And lastly, in fact, perhaps as important as anything else, this is, of course, the lifeline of the Indus River system.
Mm.
GB is home to more than 7,000 glaciers, which is the biggest single location of glaciers outside of the Arctic regions, outside of the poles. And it is this seasonal glacier melt which gives the Indus its water, which goes all the way down to the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea. And those glaciers are now not just seasonally melting, they're permanently melting, which is giving rise in the short term to floods, but in the long run means drying up of water entirely.
So to further understand, so what's the pretext taken by the government to undertake these land reforms? Is it on the name of development? Because I know in the context of national parks, the argument was to preserve natural habitat, right? So conservation. And what's the pretext this time?
Well, the pretext is, as I said, that these are sort of, if you, again, some of your listeners will know under the British, and GB was also subject to British colonial rule. The British basically did in most parts of India where they directly ruled India, they settled what they called settlement reports.
Mhm.
So they basically surveyed and measured every little inch of land and then, created a property rights regime and said, okay, this is owned by this person, this is owned by the state, this is common property. And in some of the indirectly ruled regions, of which GB is one, the so-called princely states, some of this land settlement, or in fact, large amounts of land, was never formally classified or settled. So the argument is, well, this is a long-term exercise that has been waiting to happen. There's a lot of disputes. There's a lot of, uncertainty about which land belongs to whom. And even though I don't think that that's how the local people see it, because common property doesn't belong to anyone. That's the whole point.
Mhm.
It's commonly used, and there's sort of customary sort of rules. So I don't think that this was sort of a popular demand necessarily, as much as sort of again the state determining or directing a particular regime of development, as you note. And it's also important to note that, like in KP and Balochistan, where recently we've had these very rapidly rushed through legislations around mines and minerals, GB is also home to a lot of minerals. So I think there's a lot beneath the surface that is not disclosed when you sort of have this vague explanation. Well, we need to settle the land and we need to resolve these outstanding questions of, which land belongs to whom. Whereas, in fact, I think local people see it very differently, that, they would like to retain many common property regimes, certainly maybe codify those regimes, but not in a way that it's done by fiat from above, but democratically, which, of course, as I noted at the outset, is not possible because GB has no constitutional rights.
Now, in this, if we connect it with the broader discussion in development economics, where we have two options, either privately owned property or the state-owned property, right? But here, as you allude to, there's an alternative which has been operating in many peripheral or societies in the global south, such as community-owned and managed land holdings. And that's where in GB, it was not privately owned, neither owned by state, but communities, self-governed and organized. And it has led to one of the most richest biodiversity anywhere in the region, thanks to the community-owned and managed landscapes. So people are upset because it's going to impact their livelihoods. Is that also one of the key aspect of this?
For sure. I think that it's going to impact sort of in a broad sense, how these mineral rich regions, of which GB is one, whether it's land, of course, as I noted, water resources with the glaciers and minerals. I mean, how are these new sort of exploratory regimes around the world under the guise of development? People, I think, are right to be suspicious about the fact that, well, we have a lot of, sort of very valuable resources on what is our land, but we are not being allowed to determine how those are used. And this is a basic question of self-determination, as much as it is about a right to determine how to use local resources. And this is, again, this GB is not alone in this respect in Pakistan or even around the world. And I think the question of suspicions is not just about perception. I think it is also based on previous lived experiences. So it's not as if previous developmental regimes, whether it has to do with road building or, as you say, tourist resorts or hotel building, have not engendered conflicts between sort of profiteers from the outside, including some local middlemen, and even state personnel, and then local people on the other hand. So I think that it's based on these lived experiences that there's this feeling that this is now under the guise of the so-called Land Reform Act, is going to be given legal cover, in a sense. A regime of expropriation is going to be given legal cover. And as you rightly note, this is not just about local resources and their use as livelihoods. It's also about future generations. It's also about, local ecologies. And mind you, the irony here is the people who make decisions for us are planners and our strategic spy masters. I mean, the irony is that of course GB supplies all of our water. So this is not just something that is about GB's people after all. It's also about the long-term effects of unbridled exploitation and expropriation of resources from a region which has, over thousands, in fact, hundreds of thousands of years, supported the Indus sort of basin. And we already know that the Indus basin is struggling, and downstream in Sindh, there is no water, or there's a great shortage of water because of so much diversion upstream. And that's aside from glacier melt. So I think that there's a lot of underlying, really serious structural concerns that explain the suspicion and the opposition to this act. But at the heart of it is just the fact that where I started, that if you have a region where you have 2 million people who are disenfranchised, then they have no means to articulate within any kind of democratic framework the desire to resolve such matters, which are complex. Anywhere in the world they would be complex. They're no less complex in GB. The question is, if you've not created any democratic procedures, in fact, you don't even mention the region in the constitution. I think that is ultimately where the rot starts. And then, of course, it extends into many other realms.